If you're watching this video, you're probably taking either your first or maybe your second computer science class, and presumably you want to do well in it. It doesn't matter if you're a computer science major and you have 4 more years of this to look forward to, or if you're taking this as a one-off because it's required or because you wanted to try it as an elective. All of the advice here will still apply. As a little bit about me, I graduated from Georgia Tech a couple of years ago with a 4.0 in computer science, and there were a number of things that I consistently did throughout college that helped me to do really well in those computer science courses. So I decided to condense those down into 5 main points, and that's what I really want to dive into today. So without any further ado, let's get into it. This is probably one of the biggest pieces of advice that I would give to any college student, regardless of major, and it single-handedly played a huge role in me maintaining a 4.0 all the way through college. And it's gonna sound simple, but a lot of people don't do it well. From the very beginning, day 1, syllabus day, get yourself ahead and do as much as humanly possible to not fall behind. Now, freshman year, I took this to the extreme, partially because I just like to be on top of things, as many people know, but also because I genuinely enjoyed the computer science coursework. No joke, I would wait around on Friday evenings for CS 1301 to release our homeworks, and I would just crank it out that night. And if my roommate went to sleep and we turned out the lights, I would get under my blanket and just keep on working until midnight or until I finished it. In hindsight, I probably would not do that today, and I can imagine that a lot of people have other things they would rather be doing on their Friday nights. But the reason why I mention it is because it effectively guaranteed that I would get a 100 on every single assignment. Part of this was because we used autograders in a lot of our courses, which meant that instead of submitting your homework and crossing your fingers and waiting for the grade to come back, you could submit your homework and immediately see what you would get, and you could keep resubmitting over and over again until you were happy with the results, which meant as long as you started early and were willing to put in the time, you should get a 100 on every assignment. The people who didn't get 100s were generally people who waited until the last minute. If I start working on something 3 hours before it's due and I run into bugs that I can't figure out, I'm either just not gonna get a good grade on it, or I'm gonna have to take a late penalty because I just didn't have enough time to get things working. If you start early, you should never hit that issue. And the exact same concept applies when it comes to taking tests, right? If you can start studying for all of your tests a week ahead of time, 5 days ahead of time, whatever makes sense for you, you will never be in the situation where it's the night before the test and you are cramming and panicking because you just don't have enough time to process the material. If you start studying earlier in the week, you have lots of time to figure things out. If you have issues, you can go to office hours, you can reach out to the TAs, you can do what you need to do. I think by freshman year, I didn't get anything less than an A on any of my CS tests, even if the average was in the 70s, because I always started studying early, versus the people who were so busy earlier in the week that it wasn't until the night before the test that they finally got around to studying, and then they're panicking because they don't know the stuff and the test is in 8 hours and they just don't have the time to figure it out. I know this is easier said than done, right? Given the way that different college courses pick up at different points during the semester, or because you're working a job on the side, or because you're applying to internships and interviewing and all of that kind of stuff. But if you can do your best to stick to this from the very beginning and just to hold on to it for as long as you can, and if you do start feeling yourself sliding, putting in a little bit of extra work to get yourself caught up and to get ahead again, this is probably the single biggest cheat code that I can give anyone in terms of getting A's in their college courses, not just the CS ones, but for pretty much any of them. All of coding is built on top of a relatively small set of essential concepts. Over time, you will learn how to combine these in different ways to do more advanced stuff and to solve different kinds of problems. But first, you just really need to understand what is in your toolbox. Nail home the basics, the different data types, the conditionals, the loops, the methods, the classes, all the stuff like that. If that doesn't make sense to you right now, that is totally okay. You will learn all of that in time. But once you do learn those things, drill them home. If I was going to make an analogy, because I love to make analogies, if this was like learning how to play an instrument, you'll spend some of your time learning how to play songs. And this is like learning how to write simple programs, either for a project or a homework assignment. But you're also really going to benefit from practicing your scales. And this is what I'm getting at when it comes to drilling the fundamentals. Now, I've been coding at this point for 10 years, so I don't really sit around and practice writing loops terribly often. I did that long ago. But if I was going to do something like that today, instead of just writing a for loop because I'm writing a program, I'd sit down and I'd write a for loop, and then a for loop that skips every other number, and then a for loop where I go in the opposite direction. I could do a for each loop, then do all that with a do while loop, do it with a while loop. The point is just to exercise all of those different permutations and to really get comfortable with the syntax and how those things work, so that anytime you need to use a loop, it's in your toolbox. You know which ones do which things, and you don't have to worry about where the semicolons go or the braces or the parentheses. You understand how to use those building blocks, and then you can use them for whatever it is you're working on. I mentioned this point in a video a few months ago, and it's that my freshman year, I avoided going to office hours as much as humanly possible because it made me uncomfortable. Now, freshman year, I was lucky that I could get away with not going because the material was either just clicking for me really well or because I already knew some of this stuff from when I was in high school. But throughout college, I did start going to office hours, and it became apparent to me in hindsight that I had really been shooting myself in the foot by not going earlier because it can be immensely helpful. If you are struggling, and even if you're not struggling yet, make yourself go to office hours. Get comfortable with going, ask lots of questions, and learn the material more deeply. If you aren't currently struggling, you're less likely to struggle down the line because you are being proactive about it, like that earlier point. If you can stay on top of your stuff ahead of time, you're less likely to fall behind and then struggle later. And then if you do start struggling, you won't be in that position where it feels uncomfortable or weird to go and get help and talk to the professors or the TAs, which, especially if you're someone who's introverted like me, can feel very uncomfortable. So just getting used to going to office hours and kind of building up that muscle and staying on top of things, really one of the best things you can do. The other thing that I would highly recommend in the same vein is working together with the other people in your courses. Obviously, only do this in the ways that you're permitted to by the class. I am not talking about copying each other's homeworks, but having conversations with your friends or your roommates, I did this a lot, especially freshman year and then all the way through college, can really help you to either get an understanding of what's going on if you don't understand it and someone can explain it better to you, or it can also help you build your understanding even more if you're explaining it to someone else who doesn't understand it. And then they can ask you good questions that you then need to reevaluate your own understanding, or someone else can fill in the gaps of things that you don't understand that they maybe understand. It's probably one of the best things that I did when I was in college in terms of learning outside the classroom to really fill in those gaps and understand things more thoroughly. This is something that in hindsight I can now appreciate, but at the time I don't think I really understood. But when you're first getting started, it's probably for the best to, at least to some extent, limit your use of helpful tooling. Tools can make you significantly more efficient, and they can also improve the correctness of your code. They are incredibly valuable. I use them on a day-to-day basis. They're great. But when you're first learning, relying too heavily on those things can serve as a crutch, and it can prevent you from ever fully developing how to write code without those tools. Especially if you're going to be taking your tests by hand, which is something that I did a lot of back when I was in college. You need to be able to write code without auto-completion, without AI suggestions, or without any of that kind of stuff. And you might not even realize how much you rely on those tools until they get taken away. I remember the first couple times I tried coding by hand, realizing how much I had been relying on either looking things up or tabbing to complete. And it makes you think that maybe you don't really know some of that stuff as well as you thought you did. Yes, it is going to be a pain. It is going to be slower. It is probably going to be worse quality code than if you wrote it with all of those tools. But I kind of think of this in the same way as learning how to do math by hand. Yes, eventually you're going to use a calculator and it's going to be more accurate and it's going to be way faster than you ever could be. But we still learn how to do math by hand because it's valuable to learn those fundamentals. Think of coding the same way, right? I'm not saying do all of your coding by hand. It's really impractical. Most of the time, it just doesn't make any sense unless you need to practice for interviews or for tests and all that stuff. But just spending some time in your editor or your IDE without all of those features turned on, just have some of them turned off some of the time, will make sure you really learn the fundamentals and you don't rely too heavily on those tools as a crutch when you're first learning. And I think in the long run, or just when you're taking your tests, you will be better off for it. Doing well in a computer science class does not mean that you will be a good coder or a good software engineer. Similarly, being a good coder does not mean that you will do well in a computer science class. If I think back to my very first computer science course, so much of what we were being tested on was almost trivia about coding or Python, and less so about our ability to actually write code effectively or solve problems. These are things like memorizing really small syntactical details, having to remember how to do very specific things that you would almost never do in real-world coding, and as mentioned in the previous point, doing all of this by hand and not being able to use any of the tools that you would realistically use while you're on the job in any sort of realistic modern day setting. But because of the way we were being tested, at least for pieces of it, it was the kind of class you could memorize your way through on just sheer willpower, even if things weren't really clicking. Maybe the homeworks took you forever and you never really got the hang of writing code super well, but a lot of what we were being tested on was just how much time you're willing to dedicate to memorizing those details. Now, if you're in a course like this, is this a great way of really assessing a student's abilities and how much they've learned? I'm going to say no, and I did have courses later on in college that I felt did a much better job of assessing what we were actually learning compared to some of those early classes. And if you ever end up doing a software engineering interview, you'll know what I mean. The way in which you're evaluated is often a poor representation of your real abilities. Even if you are really strong at coding, and in those early classes especially, that's great that you're kind of ahead of the game and you're really getting things and it's clicking. Understand what it means to do well in the class and on the tests, and prepare accordingly. It's in the same way that software engineers leak code when they're preparing for interviews. It's not because it's making them a better software engineer, it's because it's how you need to prepare for a lot of different interviews. All right, hopefully some of those tips were helpful. If you actually do put them into practice instead of just walking away from this video and never thinking about them again, I can almost guarantee that your grades will improve as a result. It helped me a lot when I was in college, and if I was going back and doing college all over again today, this is the video that I would show to my former self, because it really does work. Anyways, that's it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you guys in the next one.